The courtroom that morning felt less like a place of law, and more like a freezer designed to preserve secrets. The air was heavy, carrying the sterile, chemical scent of floor wax mixed with the suffocating weight of tension. It felt as though even the mahogany walls were holding their breath, waiting to see which side of history they would fall on today. Behind me, the shutter of a camera clicked a sharp, intrusive sound, then another. There. Flashes bounced off the polished brass nameplate sitting high on the bench. Judge Margaret Vane. Of course, sitting across the aisle was Councilwoman Victoria Thorne. She sat with a posture that must have been practiced in front of a mirror for decades, spine rigid, chin lifted with that specific brand of political arrogance that mimics grace but lacks warmth. Beside her sat Arthur Thorne, my father. He refused to look at me. He stared at his hands, as if guilt was something he could hide if he just stayed quiet enough. Victoria's attorney, a man named Mr. Sterling, arranged his documents on the table with the terrifying calm of someone who had already read the last page of the book and knew exactly who won. He looked bored. Why wouldn't he be? In their minds, this was just a formality. Then came the opening statement, words that were designed to pierce deeper than any legal. "This girl," Sterling said, gesturing vaguely in my direction, without making offhand eye contact, "only knows how to squander what she has never earned. She is unfit." That girl was me, Elena. The daughter Victoria had looked through like a glass window for most of my life. Now, I was the only obstacle standing between her and the substantial fortune my grandmother, Rose Sterling, had left in her will. It wasn't the greed that made my blood run cold. I was used to their greed. It was the ease with which my mother performed cruelty. She didn't even blink. The judge, Margaret Vane, nodded faintly at the lawyer's words, a movement so small you would miss it if you weren't looking for. "And," Mr. Sterling smiled. It was that small, confident smirk of men who believe that handshakes in back rooms outrank the truth in open court. But they didn't know one thing. I had been preparing for this specific moment since the day I learned that justice in our town of Oakwood Valley often came with a heavy price tag. My pulse, which had been racing in the lobby, suddenly steadied. My voice, when I thought about what I had to do, did not shake. When I rose to speak, the sound of my wooden chair, scraping against the marble floor, echoed loudly, sounding like the first crack of thunder before a 2 words. That was all I needed to bring their entire performance crashing down. Judicial disclosures. If you have ever watched someone you love twist the concept of family into a weapon to hurt to you, then you will want to hear what happened next. Because what followed in that courtroom didn't just win a case. It rewrote everything they thought they could control. Childhood never felt like the beginning of a life to me. It felt like an endless waiting room in a house built for someone else's ambitions. Oakwood Valley was a picture-perfect town on the front. Outside, the lawns were always manicured, the fences freshly painted, the families polished like trophies. But inside our home, affection was rationed like water in a drought. My mother, Councilwoman Victoria Thorne, treated warmth as a limited resource, something to be traded for votes or influence. My father, Arthur, lived in the quiet, dusty spaces her ambition left behind. I learned before I could even tie my shoes that silence pleased her. Approval in that house came from stillness, from obedience, from being invisible. But Rose Sterling, my grandmother, never asked me to be quiet. She carried sunlight into every room she entered. She always smelled of cedar wood and fresh lavender soap. Her hands were steady and warm, her laughter was loud and unfiltered, and her kindness was deliberate. She used to tell me, "Elena, money is a tool. It should serve a purpose, not your pride." Rose founded a small community foundation that provided scholarships to local students who couldn't afford college. I used to follow her to the office every weekend. The walls were covered with framed photos of the graduates she had helped over the decades. "They remind me why we are here," she once told me, adjusting a crooked frame. I didn't understand it then. I was too young. But I certainly understand it now. Victoria and Rose shared nothing but DNA. My mother saw generosity as a weakness, a leak in the hull of her ship. My grandmother saw it as a duty, the wind in her sails. When election seasons arrived, Victoria transformed. She turned into a stage version of herself. Perfect hair, perfect posture, rehearsed smiles, and speeches about family values that she never actually practiced at home. Rose stayed away from those events. She called them theater. The distance between mother and daughter became permanent long before I was old enough to choose a side. Rose never flaunted her wealth, but she had plenty. Years of quiet, smart investments made her independent in a way my mother could never control. That independence irritated Victoria more than poverty ever would have. She hated that she couldn't pull Rose's strings. When the forgetting began, it was small things. Misplacing her reading glasses, repeating a story about her garden twice in 10 minutes, losing track of what day of the week it was. At first I blamed old age. It happens, I thought. Then I learned the word Alzheimer's, and that world tilted on its axis. I was 22 years old when Rose decided to sell her big estate and move into a smaller, manageable cottage at the edge of town. I moved in with her without a second thought. My mother didn't argue. In fact, she seemed relieved. It was convenient for her, one less person to worry about while she campaigned. Those 2 years living in the cottage became my true education in love. Rose's mind flickered, like an old film projector skipping scenes, blurring faces, but she never lost her tone. Even when she looked at me with blank eyes and forgot my name, she smiled as if her heart still remembered exactly who I was. She would hum old jazz songs while I sat at the kitchen table paying her bills and cooking dinner. I learned patience from the repetition of her questions. I learned courage from the exhaustion of sleepless nights. And I learned grace from watching a strong woman fade away without a single ounce of bitterness. Victoria visited only when the cameras did. She brought photographers massive bouquets of flowers that Rose was allergic to, and a mask of false concern. The nurses whispered behind her, back about how polished she looked, as if looking good was the same as being good. I stayed silent in the corner because anger was useless against someone who had turned guilt into a personal brand. The final winter was the quietest. Rose spoke less, slept more, and held my hand longer. One night, while cleaning out her desk, I found her old notebooks, letters she never sent, recipes she never cooked, speeches she never gave. Among them was a thick, sealed envelope labeled, "For Elena." Inside was a handwritten letter and a notarized will. She left everything, her entire estate, her savings, the property, and the foundation to me. She wrote in the letter, "Kindness must be inherited the same way money is, or the money will vanish into thin air." When she passed away that spring, the cottage felt enormous and empty. But I didn't cry. Grief had been living with me for months already. We were old friends. I organized the funeral alone. Victoria arrived in immaculate black silk, greeting donors with camera-ready sorrow. Her eulogy was about family unity, a speech that drew polite applause from the town, but made my wan stomach twist into knots. For a while, peace existed in the paperwork. I managed the estate, answered thousands of condolence cards, and began running Rose's foundation just as she would have wanted. Then, the envelope appeared. It was taped to my front door, bearing the heavy, embossed logo of Jameson Ford Associates, my mother's high-powered law firm. Someone had told her about the will. That evening, she arrived without warning. I remember the sharp click-clack of her heels on the soddy, hardwood floor, the tremor of rage in the air when she saw the documents sitting on the table. The mask of public grace slid right off her face, revealing something underneath that was sharper and colder than grief. Power doesn't mourn. Power plots. In her eyes, I wasn't her daughter anymore. I was a mistake. I was the obstacle standing between her and total control. That was the day I realized that love in our family had skipped a generation, and the one person who had cherished me was gone, forever. What remained was the beginning of a war I hadn't chosen, but one I would have to finish. By early autumn, peace was just a rumor in Oakwood Valley. The hills around the town glowed, with golden leaves, pretending to be calm, while tension coiled underneath the surface like a snake. My mother had found her rhythm again, not in motherhood, but in warfare disguised as politics. It began with whispers in the grocery store that grew their own legs. Then the articles followed. They were dressed up as compassion pieces but engineered like bear traps. Daughter inherits, fortune amidst family concerns. Is the legacy safe? Questions arise over estate. Every line suggested manipulation. Each photo of me was unflattering, placed beside words like greed, inexperience, and betrayal. In Oakwood Valley, rumor was a currency more valuable than gold, and Councilwoman Victoria Thorne was the richest woman in town. She crafted sympathy-like policy, her smile timed perfectly for the evening headlines. I didn't need confirmation. The fingerprints of her strategy were everywhere. My father called me once, his voice quiet and cautious, asking if I could just resolve things quietly to help your mother. He sounded like a man trying to bargain with a thunderstorm. I ended the call gently. Grief was no longer my weakness. It had hardened into armor. I hired Sarah Bennett, a lawyer whose calm demeanor unnerved people. She didn't offer me comfort or tea. She offered process. Her first instruction was simple. Document everything. Every breath, every scrap of paper. She told me, the goal isn't to fight emotion with emotion. We fight pressure with precision. Soon, the envelopes arrived daily. Legal threats, demands for mental health evaluations, insinuations of elder abuse. Each one was designed to exhaust me rather than accuse me of anything real. My mother's campaign machine was operating perfectly, drained the will and the bank account before the trial even began. Sarah built order from the chaos. We created a log for every phone call, every press statement, every piece of manufactured outrage. They want a reaction, Sarah reminded me constantly. Give them records instead. Meanwhile, my mother smiled on television. Her campaign commercials dripped with sincerity. She spoke about protecting family heritage and honoring her late mother's values. The same hand that was signing legal motions to destroy me was gesturing about morality to voters. Oakwood Valley applauded her story. I became the villain, the contrast that made her light shine brighter. Reporters camped outside my office, pretending to be curious about the charity, but only asking about the lawsuit. The foundation's work was overshadowed by a scandal that never existed. Through the noise, Sarah stayed unshaken. Facts, she said, age better than rumors. So we collected them. Old bank statements, donation records, foundation archives going back 20 years. The more we gathered, the clearer the pattern became. One name appeared too often to be ignored, Judge Margaret Vane. At first, I dismissed it as a coincidence. The city was small, professionals overlapped. But Sarah found records showing consistent personal donations from the judge to Victoria's campaigns. Each donation was carefully calculated to be just $1 below the public reporting threshold. Curiosity turned into cold certainty. I began searching through online archives, buried social media posts from staff members, and local news photos from a decade ago. Again and again, they appeared side by side, at fundraisers, at private dinners, at charity galas. Their smiles looked natural, practiced, synchronized. These weren't glimpses of professionalism. They were evidence of comfort, a connection strong enough to blur the lines of the law. My grandmother used to say, integrity doesn't erode overnight, Elena. It dissolves quietly like sugar in tea until the reflection in the mirror belongs to someone else. That is exactly what I saw in those photos. When public slander failed to break me, the threats shifted tone. Anonymous messages warned me to think carefully about my future. A black sedan lingered outside my gate for hours one night. Fear tried to introduce itself to me, but I had learned discipline from caregiving, stillness, under chaos. Sarah insisted we stay silent publicly. They'll use your defense as a confession, she said. So we worked in the dark, layering facts like bricks in a wall. My apartment filled with folders and timelines, every line connecting my mother's political power to the judge's judicial favor. It no longer looked like a home. It looked like a blueprint of corruption. Victoria's empire ran on control. Mine was running on patience. She had always won, by being louder. I would win by being exact. Each document became its own verdict. Each photo was a mirror she couldn't escape. The final connection arrived one evening in a forgotten event archive from 12 years ago. Judge Vane had officiated the opening fundraiser of Victoria's very first campaign. Her signature sat right beside my mother's on the sponsor list, the ink preserved in glossy print. It was small, almost elegant, and absolutely damning. I stared at the evidence under the desk lamp. The yellow glow painted my hands pale, but they were steady. Somewhere between the fear and the fatigue, a realization surfaced. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about exposure. For years she had built a machine that shaped perception. Now the same machine had left a trail too intricate to erase. The pressure she designed to crush me was starting to crush her. Instead, morning arrived without promise. The sky was a pale, indifferent gray above Oakwood Valley. "Every battle needs structure," Sarah said. I took her advice literally. My living room became a war room. I didn't need rage to fight. I needed rhythm. Councilwoman Victoria Thorne wasn't just a mother defending pride. She was a public figure, defending an image. And image had rules sharper than law. Sarah Bennett reviewed every file, with the patience of a surgeon. She built our case piece by piece, turning suspicion into an undeniable sequence. I watched her transform my fear into evidence. The process numbed me at first. It demanded discipline, not emotion. While others lived their lives, I lived in tax forms, donation receipts, property transfers, and social event logs. The monotony became a kind of prayer. Between the side lines of numbers, the pattern sharpened like a blade. Judge Margaret Vane appeared again and again, listed on charity boards, tagged in campaign newsletters, photographed at fundraisers hosted by my mother's committee. The connection was no longer coincidence, it was design. Victoria had always mastered optics. Friendship with a judge wasn't corruption when it was hidden beneath philanthropy. Every gala became camouflage. I began collecting not just documents, but details. The dates of overlapping events, the sequence of financial filings, the repetition of names on guest lists. Each discovery was a brick. In the wall, Sarah wanted me to build a barrier made not of anger, but of accuracy. Outside, the narrative remained loud. My mother's public team continued its quiet theater, billboards, interviews, charity drives, all perfectly timed to drown out any hint of scandal. She smiled beside children holding the very scholarships my grandmother had once funded, rewriting the legacy into an advertisement for herself. Watching it felt like grief in a new costume. I stopped expecting fairness. Justice, I realized, wasn't balance. It was endurance. The more pressure they created, the steadier I became. The human body adapts, the human heart learns. Restraint. Sarah filed preliminary motions, anticipating the storm. Every draft passed through her hands, until the language became weaponry. She believed in precision the way soldiers believe in armor. "Let the evidence speak before you do," she told me once. And I understood she wasn't talking about court strategy, but survival. Nights blurred into quiet mornings. Sleep became optional. I woke with ideas for referencing files, checked timestamps, verified signatures. Fear had no room to grow inside this. To routine. One evening, while arranging photographs chronologically, I noticed something subtle. The same floral arrangement on two separate event stages, years apart. The sponsor lists were identical. Beneath the printed decorum lay a clear pattern of financial interdependence. Between the judge's charity and my mother's re-election fund, that small repetition, unnoticed by most, became the thread that tied everything together. Sarah confirmed it within hours. The records aligned perfectly. "This isn't influence," she said, scanning the papers with wide eyes. "It's infrastructure." She was right. What I had uncovered wasn't corruption born from desperation. It was architecture built over years, steady and deliberate. It explained why every door I had tried to knock on closed politely in my face. The network wasn't protecting my mother's innocence. It was protecting its own convenience. I realized then that the wall I was building wasn't just a defense. It was containment. A way to trap the system that had cornered me. Each document tightened the space around their lies, until movement became impossible. By late winter, our case stood ready. Sarah assembled the evidence into sequences, even a biased mind couldn't ignore. I memorized every exhibit, every time, every name. When fear tried to speak, I replaced it with data. My mother's campaign looked flawless from the outside, but internally, her control was cracking. Anonymous resignations surfaced from her staff. 2 sponsors withdrew their support, citing ethical concerns. Her silence grew louder, and silence was the one thing I had learned to read. The wall was complete, not of bricks, but of truth, so meticulously arranged it could withstand anything built on pretense. And as the court date approached, I understood the quiet satisfaction my grandmother must have felt in every act of patience, because revenge, when built carefully, doesn't shout, it stands. The morning of the trial felt sterile. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with their lenses, raised like weapons. Inside, silence had weight. I took my seat, breathing in the stillness that comes before a verdict. Councilwoman Victoria Thorne sat across the aisle, wrapped in composure too perfect to be real. Her lawyer arranged his notes with theatrical precision. Between them, power hummed, like electricity behind glass. At the bench, Judge Margaret Vane looked poised, almost detached. Only I knew the fault line. Beneath her calm, years of entanglement dressed as friendship. The air itself seemed aware of. When the proceedings began, the lawyer spoke in the rhythm of manipulation. His arguments were rehearsed to sound Humanian appeal to morality, not greed. He painted me as misguided, too young to understand the responsibility of inheritance. Every phrase tried to shrink me into something fragile. I didn't react. Sarah had taught me the discipline of stillness. Let them exhaust themselves first. The hearing stretched like an elastic band. The clock ticked without mercy. I could feel the audience shifting, sympathy being molded by tone rather than truth. That was my mother's greatest talent, performance mistaken for sincerity. When her turn came, Victoria delivered what sounded less like testimony and more like a campaign speech. She spoke of community, sacrifice, and a daughter who lost her way. Her voice trembled at all the right moments. To anyone who didn't know her, it would have been moving. To me, it was choreography. Then it was my turn. I rose, carrying the folder that had become both shield and sword. The room seemed to shrink. As I walked to the table, the light above the judge's bench reflected on the polished floor like a warning. Facts don't need volume, I thought. They only need sequence. I opened the first file. Each exhibit built upon the last. Donation records, photographs, correspondence. Every layer revealing the quiet network between the judge and my mother. No accusations, just alignment. Patterns so precise they didn't need interpretation. When the final photograph slid across the table, the energy in the room changed instantly. It showed Judge Vane standing beside Victoria at a fundraising podium, hands clasped, smiles. Identical. The image was harmless alone, but devastating in context. The silence that followed felt alive. Even the lawyer's pen stopped moving. For a fraction of a second, the judge's control fractured. Her breath caught, her hand trembled. Then, like instinct, she nodded, agreeing with my mother's earlier claim about my unworthiness. That tiny motion was enough. The mask cracked in public view. I didn't need to speak. The truth had spoken through posture, through reaction, through the eminent, small betrayal of human instinct. Sarah's motion for recusal followed the next heartbeat. The courtroom froze as the judge struggled to recover composure, but professionalism couldn't undo what the audience had already seen. Margaret Vane's ruling was swift, mechanical, stripped of confidence. She upheld the will. She confirmed my inheritance. She dismissed all claims of undue influence. Her voice wavered through the closing statement, each word an act of damage control. Victoria's face remained still, but the stillness was different this time. It wasn't strategy, it was shock. Control had always been her religion, and I had just turned her faith into evidence. When the gavel fell, the sound echoed like closure made physical. The reporters moved first, chasing quotes, chasing chaos. I didn't move. I watched my mother stand, her expression flickering between disbelief and calculation. That moment, the second, she realized the narrative was no longer hers, was the quietest victory I had ever known. The days that followed blurred together. Judge Margaret Vane submitted her resignation within a week, citing personal health reasons. The statement was short, but the consequences were long. The State Judicial Review Board opened an inquiry. Each report revealed another thread: favors, private appearances, compromised ethics. Councilwoman Victoria Thorne followed quickly down the same slope. The City Council launched an ethics review. Donors evaporated. Former allies distanced themselves. Her campaign office closed overnight. Its windows papered in blank white sheets where her slogans used to be. Sarah said, "We had done more than win. We had exposed a pattern." At night, my phone buzzed with congratulations. I didn't know how to answer. Revenge felt hollow. Justice is quieter than people imagine. It doesn't roar, it releases. I passed by the courthouse a few days later. The steps looked different, though unchanged. I realized places never hold the weight. People do. And those who carry truth eventually set it down, not because they are done fighting, but because they are tired of carrying it alone. The estate was officially mine. Every property, every share, every dollar. Yet, the moment I signed the last page, I didn't feel wealth. I felt gravity. My grandmother's handwriting flashed through my memory. Kindness must outlive fear. Victoria never reached out. No apology, no denial, not even anger. Her silence felt strategic at first, but later I understood it was the absence of power. She had no language for a world she didn't control. The news cycle moved on, as it always does, but I finally exhaled.